This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On September 15th, the Institute hosted our first virtual military history night for the fall 2021 program season. Our guest was Canadian historian Paul McNicholls, joining us from Vancouver with an account of the Red River Expedition of 1870. British regulars and Canadian volunteers in the Canadian wilderness.
All right, well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Patricia Hine-White. I organize this event. Welcome to RCMI's virtual military history night, Wednesday, September the 15th, 2021. This presentation will be videotaped for educational purposes and available for viewing on RCMI YouTube channel. There will be a question and answer following this presentation, and I ask you to mute your mics and hold any questions until that time. I would like at this time to extend special thanks to RCMI behind the scenes team for their expertise and strong support, without which this presentation would not happen. Our speaker this evening is Paul McNicholls, and his topic, the Red River Expeditionary Force of 1870. Born in England, our speaker has spent most of his life in British Columbia. He studied history at the university, but following graduation, he gravitated into the world of insurance, and throughout his working life, he carried on a parallel life of historical study, and now happily retired, he is now immersed in the career he always should have been in, the research and writing of history. The author of Journey Through the Wilderness, Gardiner Wolseley's Canadian Red River Expedition of 1870, which is the topic for tonight's presentation, he is also currently researching two books, Monty, the story of Donald Montgomery, the brother of Field Marshal Sir Bernard Montgomery, who served with the Canadian Corps in the First World War. And the other book is Canada in the Boer War. Paul is a 2020 recipient of the Brown Award for an article he wrote on tonight's topic for the UK publication, Soldiers of the Queen. So ladies and gentlemen, I invite you all to sit back as Paul, for the next 45 minutes, will transport us back in time to the spring of 1870 with a thrilling, action-packed story of Garnet Wolseley's Canadian Red River Expedition, when the Anglo-Canadian military expedition set out from Toronto to Fort Garry to preempt the US attempt to take over the vast lands of the Hudson's Bay Company and what was to be the last British Army campaign in Canada. So without further ado, Paul, a warm welcome, and the floor, virtually speaking, is yours.
Thank you very much, Pat. I'd like to begin tonight by thanking the Royal Canadian Military Institute for inviting me to speak, and also thank everybody who's taken the time to tune in tonight to listen to me. Somewhat surprisingly, the Red River Expedition has largely been ignored by military scholars of the British Army during the Victorian era. As I would also find out after being approached to write about it by Helion and Company in the UK, it's a much more complex story than I had imagined. I'll try to do justice to it in the time available to me tonight. A quick note. I'll be using place names, Red River Settlement and Upper Fort Garry, somewhat interchangeably during my talk. In 1870, the Red River Settlement was the largest single community within the lands administered by the Hudson's Bay Company. Upper Fort Garry was the headquarters of the 8th BC in the Northwest and located in the heart of the Red River Settlement. Unsurprisingly, if there's an upper fort, there'll be a lower fort as well. Lower Fort Garry was downriver from the upper fort, but still within the settlement. While the presentation will deal with the planning and execution of the expedition itself, I do need to provide some background. Though these were complex events, it has to be said, and I'll be dealing with them only very briefly. In a nutshell, Canada was in the process of acquiring the vast lands of what would become the Canadian West from the ABC. The Canadian government, however, had done nothing to inform or prepare the settlement's inhabitants for the forthcoming takeover. Just over 48% of the Red River settlement's population at the time was made up of French-speaking people of mixed ethnicity. These were the Métis, and the man who rose to their leadership at this moment was Louis Riel. The Métis were seeking to protect their culture and guarantee their rights, specifically those of land ownership. The English-speaking groups in residence, by and large, did not face the same issues and so did not necessarily share the same concerns, though it is safe to say that not all English speakers were opposed to Riel and not all French speakers supported him. Ultimately, a political agreement was hammered out by the settlement's various English and French-speaking groups. 3 representatives from Red River then traveled to Ottawa, and an agreement was reached with the Canadian government. The Manitoba Act followed and was granted royal assent on May 12, 1870. It was to come into effect on July 15th. When the terms of this agreement reached the Red River settlement, Riel expressed satisfaction, and it was ratified by the Red River Assembly. However, at the beginning of March of 1870, after the agreement had been reached at the settlement, but before the delegates set out for Canada, something occurred that would have a profound impact on the events that followed. Thomas Scott, a man being held prisoner at Upper Fort Garry, which during the winter had been seized by the Métis, was executed after a summary trial. By all accounts, he was a difficult individual, although whether this justified him being killed is another matter. Word of Scott's death caused outrage in Ontario, with widespread calls for the dispatch of a military expedition to avenge his death. So let's talk a little bit about the military background to this. At some point, Canada was going to send a military force to the West for the maintenance of law and order, as well as the defense of its new empire in the West. However, once he became aware of what was going on at the Red River settlement, Prime Minister Sir John A. Macdonald began to contemplate the early dispatch of such a force. Some of his early statements on the subject were also more indicative of sending a punitive expedition rather than the maintenance of law and order. It should all be said, though, that while the negotiations at the settlement were underway, he did reject an offer from the man who would ultimately command the Red River expedition to accompany the Prime Minister's representative on his journey to the West. Macdonald felt that this would be provocative, though he certainly did not rule out an aggressive response if an agreement was not reached. However, it was recognized in Ottawa that Canada lacked the expertise to carry out such an operation, and so would need to seek British organizational assistance as well as participation. A Canadian Privy Council memorandum in February 1870 spoke of a military force with British troops included being at Fort William on Thunder Bay by May 1st and led by, quote, a British officer of reputation. Canada's part-time voluntary active militia relied heavily on the British garrison for training and a great many other support functions as well. But for reasons we don't have time to delve into tonight, at the beginning of 1870, the British government of William Gladstone announced that other than at Halifax, Britain would be withdrawing its garrison from Canada by the end of the year. As I'm sure everybody can appreciate, this was perhaps not the best time for Macdonald to approach the Governor General looking for British military assistance for a military expedition to the West. This slide shows Lord Granville, the British Colonial Secretary, and Gladstone, the Prime Minister. It was with considerable reluctance that Prime Minister Gladstone and Colonial Secretary Lord Granville agreed on March 5th to the participation of a small British force, but with conditions. Before British troops could begin the journey west, adequate terms were to be agreed with the residents of the Red River settlement, and the transfer of the land from the HBC to Canada must be completed. It was also stated that British troops were to be accompanied by a larger Canadian force. It should be emphasized, too, that British participation would not change the timetable of the withdrawal of the garrison. This meant that British troops would have to get to the Red River settlement and return in a single season. Given that the severe winter climate of the North American interior would limit the time frame within which the journey could be conducted, a round trip in a single season was going to be challenging. Throughout this story, for the British, time was always the factor of major importance. Despite the demands from angry voices in Ontario, from Gladstone and Granville's perspectives, this was not going to be a punitive expedition. In fact, when they first gave their reluctant approval, those angry voices in Ontario had not yet been raised. Also, a Colonial Office communication on March 23rd spoke of the maintenance of order at the settlement during the, quote, Canadian annexation as the reason for the sending of a military force. And Gladstone continued to have doubts, which he discussed with Granville. Granville was reluctant too, but he thought that support could not be withdrawn once it had been given. There's also an American dimension to the story. This slide shows President Grant, who was the president in Washington at the time, and his Secretary of State, Hamilton Fish. The fear of the US moving into the Northwest ahead of Canada was a strong influence on Ottawa's decision-making. Aside from the need for military expertise from Britain, Macdonald believed that with Imperial troops involved, Washington would take notice that despite the withdrawal of its garrison, Britain still took an interest in her North American colonies. In fact, the ties of empire were not particularly strong in the Liberal cabinet in London at this time. And what we also now know is that the United States had no intention of intervening militarily, though they would not do anything to smooth the journey of an Anglo-Canadian expedition. The view in Washington was more a case of anticipating that the lands of the West, and even Canada itself, would ultimately fall into their lap by means other than military conquest. There were American citizens at the Red River settlement as well, who reported that it would be impossible for the British and Canadians to send a sizable military force from Canada due to the lack of a viable route. It seemed that all Washington had to do was wait. And speaking of those routes, the best routes to the Northwest were south of the Great Lakes through the US. By 1870, there was a railway to St. Paul and a riverboat service on the Red River from American territory to Upper Fort Garry. Washington even expected the Canadian government to ask for permission to access its territory to get its men to the Red River settlement. It had been determined that the answer would be a firm refusal. And let's also quickly deal with the attitude of Louis Riel to US intervention. There were Americans close to Riel at the settlement during the Troubles. That they would influence him to call for US intervention was one of Ottawa's fears. It is, however, highly unlikely that Riel ever intended on calling for US support, though he may have taken advantage of its perceived threat as leverage during the negotiation stage. There was, though, a very real military threat to Canada originating in the US at this time, the Fenian raids by Irish veterans of the American Civil War. Canada's response to these attacks had a significant impact on the development of the active militia. 2 battles would be fought in Quebec as the Red River Expeditionary Force was landing at Thunder Bay, Eccles Hill on May 25th and Trout River on May 27th. The significance for the Red River expedition was that precautions would be required against Fenian incursions whenever the expedition came close to US territory, as it would on a number of occasions during its trek west. It was one more issue with which the planners would have to contend. So let's talk a little bit about the command structure of the expedition. With the pending withdrawal of the British garrison, the senior British Army position in Canada had been transferred from Montreal to Halifax. However, in light of Gladstone's decision to support the expedition, the War Office in London became uneasy at not having a senior officer closer to the center of events and worried that this might jeopardize the withdrawal timetable. As such, Lieutenant General James Lindsay was sent from England to take charge in central Canada. He arrived in Montreal on April 4th. He was efficient and hard driving and was not afraid to rustle feathers when he deemed it necessary. That's Lindsay on the left in the picture on the slide. The picture on the right is Colonel Garnet Wolseley. He came from an impoverished Anglo-Irish military family, and in an era when army advancement was based on purchase, he had advanced solely on merit. In 1870, he had been in Canada for 8 years, having been among the troops rushed to British North America in the aftermath of the Trent incident during the summer. Wolseley was exceedingly competent and detail-oriented, ambitious, and somewhat egotistical. He was also a supporter of practical training and army reform and was popular with the troops. By 1870, he was Deputy Quartermaster General. At 34 years of age, the youngest officer in Canada to have been appointed to the senior staff position. In anticipation of the arrival of Lindsay, he had authored the Memorandum regarding the dispatch of an armed force to the Red River Territory. This document included information on troop numbers, method of movement, and logistic requirements. It was a major reason behind Lindsay being brought so quickly up to speed upon his arrival in Montreal. It is little wonder, therefore, that Wolseley was chosen as the expedition's commanding officer. He was by far the most competent man Lindsay had at his disposal. A little sidebar here. Wolseley had hoped to be appointed the Lieutenant Governor of Canada's new empire as well as military commander of the expedition, but this was not to be. There will be a footnote regarding this at the end of the story. So let's talk a little bit about the route. The planners looked at 3 routes, but never contemplated requesting the 4th option of access through US territory. They selected the old Northwest Company route from Thunder Bay on Lake Superior with the Kaministiquia River as its starting point. This route had largely fallen into disuse after the merging of the Northwest Company with the HBC in 1821. From here on in as well, I'm going to refer to this river as the Cam, as I'm told that's what the locals call it. The time frame for Lake Superior to be ice-free was a limiting factor, though not as limiting as Hudson's Bay and the Hayes River route, one of the discounted options, but also the one which had been taken by 2 previous military expeditions to the settlement in 1846 and 1857. Another attraction of the Cam River route was that a road was already under construction from Thunder Bay to Shebondowan Lake. This would alleviate the challenge of moving up the difficult Cam River with its numerous rapids and the largest waterfall in the entire Lake Superior watershed. We shall hear more of this road as the story continues. The advent of railways and steamships also meant it was easier to reach Thunder Bay than in the days of the Northwest Company, though larger vessels required access to the canal on the US side at Sault Ste. Marie. We're going to hear more about this as well. All told, the expedition would travel 1,228 miles, 94 by rail from Toronto to Collingwood, 534 by steamer from Collingwood to Thunder Bay, 50 from Thunder Bay to Shebondowan Lake along the newly constructed road, and 550 by boat from Shebondowan Lake to Upper Fort Garry. During this latter stage, it was going to be a journey across lakes, rivers, portages, and the watersheds of the Canal. The water flowed against the expedition until they crossed into the Hudson's Bay watershed, about 1,000 feet above Thunder Bay. Then it would be with them until they entered the Red River on the last leg of their journey. However, even when in their favor, the rugged topography meant the trek was always challenging and dangerous. 102 boats had been ordered before Lindsay arrived, but he thought this number would be insufficient, and within a few days, another 33 were under construction. They varied in size from 25 to 33 feet in length, 6.5 to 7.5 feet in width, and 30 to 35 inches in depth. Canoes had been the mode of transport when the route was in use by the Northwest Company, and the expedition would be equipped with 2 canoes as well as a gig. However, the route chosen had never before been used by such a large body of men, and most of it had never seen boats of this size. So let's talk about the raising of the force. Sounds like Star Wars line. The British designated the 1st Battalion of the King's Royal Rifle Corps as their infantry component. This battalion had been in Canada since early in 1867. The phrase "redcoats on the Red River" is sometimes seen in relation to the expedition. To be completely literal, British Army rifle regiments wore green uniforms. The Canadians would be kitted out in the same manner. Raising the Canadian contingent was more complicated. When Lindsay arrived, he was angered to discover that nothing yet had been done. Remember the British time factor, and it was already approaching the middle of April by the time Lindsay got there. He suggested using the Royal Canadian Rifles, a regiment of the British Army permanently stationed in Canada. With the withdrawal of the British garrison, it was to be disbanded. They were trained and ready to go, but Lindsay's offer was rejected by the Department of Militia. The Militia Department determined to raise 2 battalions of volunteers, one from the existing militia regiments of Ontario and one from those in Quebec. There was no shortage of volunteers in Ontario, where feelings ran high regarding Thomas Scott. Quebec was a different story. Here there were 2 problems. First, French-speaking members of the militia were reluctant to volunteer. And second, English-speaking members were unwilling to serve under French-speaking officers. Lindsay eventually lost patience and stepped in. He recruited 120 men from the Royal Canadian Rifles and the rest in Ontario. Organizing these 2 battalions, however, would take some time. The expedition would consist of 3 battalions of infantry comprising 7 companies each. There was a Royal Artillery contingent with 4 brass 7-pounder guns. There were also detachments from the Royal Engineers, the Army Service Corps, and the Army Hospital Corps. All told, the expedition's troop strength came in at approximately 1,200 officers and men. There were also around 400 boatmen and guides hired by the Canadian Public Works Department. 1 company of the Quebec Battalion would remain as a garrison at a fort to be constructed on Thunder Bay, and 1 company of the Ontario Battalion would remain temporarily as a garrison at Fort Francis, which would be established as a forward base along the line of advance. So we're going to talk a little bit about the approval to proceed. The gentleman in this photograph is Sir John Young, the Governor General at the time, and word of approval would be communicated through him by the government in London. Once the British terms and conditions for the participation of its troops had been satisfied, on May 6, 1870, authorization was given for the British troops to proceed, and Wolseley received his orders from Lindsay on the 12th. However, Wolseley did not begin to move the lead elements of the expedition from Toronto until May 21st. These dates are important when considering some of the controversies that will follow. There are a surprising number of talking points surrounding the expedition. This was a bit of a surprise to me when I began my research into the topic. Wolseley would later allege that some had led to delays and laid the blame firmly at the feet of the Canadians. The 3 most significant in this regard are the hiring of the lake steamers, the canal at Sault Ste. Marie, and the road from Thunder Bay to Sheboygan Lake. We'll deal with them individually. A supply train of ships was going to be necessary to carry the expedition and its supplies from Collingwood to Thunder Bay. When it appeared that matters had stalled over the chartering of these vessels, Lindsay went to Collingwood and oversaw the settling of terms with the owners of 3. He was, however, then instructed by Ottawa that the matter was to be handled by the Canadian Postmaster General. After further time had elapsed, with seemingly nothing having been done, Lindsay authorized the chartering of 5 ships. Wolseley was incensed by this perceived Canadian inaction. But had the Canadian government actually done nothing? In fact, they had secretly chartered 1 steamer, possibly 2, under a very lucrative mail contract. Presumably, this secrecy was aimed at the Americans. However, it would seem that the news was kept from the British too. In any case, 1 or even 2 steamers was never going to be enough, and so Lindsay's hirings were certainly necessary. The muddle resulting from the British planners being kept in the dark, however, was unhelpful and certainly led to unnecessary work. But did it result in a delay to the commencement of operations? The answer is no. Wolseley said it delayed his departure by 2 weeks, but the evidence just doesn't support this. While the steamer saga was underway, the official journal of the expedition clearly speaks to the colonel being involved in planning and staff work, as well as readying the 2 Canadian battalions. Regarding the latter matter, he possibly would have had a legitimate grievance regarding delay. This was the reason why it took Wolseley until May 21st to begin his move forward, when Lindsay had given him his orders on the 12th. He was simply still busy making the final preparations. So let's have a look at the second allegation of delay, the canal at Sault Ste. Marie. Between Lake Superior and Huron, St. Mary's River drops 23 feet. To facilitate the movement of ships between the 2 lakes, the Americans had constructed a canal on their side at Sault Ste. Marie. The planners of the expedition had surprisingly taken for granted that the US authorities would allow them use of this canal. Lindsay and Wolseley were astute men, so it's something of a mystery that they made such a leap of faith. Adding to the mystery, the US Secretary of State advised the British minister in Washington on more than one occasion that a military expedition would be denied use of the canal. It would seem this news was not conveyed to the expedition's planners, which is curious, to put it mildly. In fact, the first steamer of the season did get through on May 5th. The second was turned back on May 8th, and this precipitated the crisis. Washington was prevailed upon fairly quickly to relent. The canal was open to British use by May 17th. Use of the canal was, however, conditional on no troops or material for the expedition being on board the steamers while they passed through. It had always been the intent that the troops would be disembarked. However, removing the expedition's stores and supplies as well meant that the Canadian side of Sault Ste. Marie for a time gained an importance the planners had not envisaged. As a consequence, the first troops of the expedition to move from Toronto were from the Ontario Rifles and bound not for Thunder Bay, but for Sault Ste. Marie to provide a garrison. But did the canal closure result in a delay? Wolseley would later claim it had. As with the matter of the steamers, there's no evidence to support this either, and for the same reasons as before. Wolseley was simply busy finalizing the arrangements of the expedition's departure. So the third allegation of delay, I've already mentioned the road that was under construction between Thunder Bay and Sheboygan Lake. The road would run for almost 50 miles. And as the lake sits 839 feet above Thunder Bay, it would be a considerable saving of time and effort for the expedition, as they would be able to bypass the difficult rapids and falls of the Cam River. Its construction was being handled by Simon J. Dawson of the Canadian Public Works Department. And there's a picture of Dawson on the slide. The truth of the matter, however, was that the road was simply not going to be ready for when the expeditionary force arrived. The leading elements began landing at Thunder Bay on May 25th at a place they named Prince Arthur's Landing, which was close to Fort William. The first troops did not, in fact, set out on Shebondown Lake until late in the day on July 16th. So May 25th to July 16th, considerable time. Simon Dawson was responsible for a great many tasks associated with the expedition, not just the road. He was efficient and capable, but likely had far too much on his plate. However, work on the road was not assisted by the torrential rain that poured in the days and weeks after the force landed, or the forest fires that had swept through the area prior to their arrival. The latter destroyed bridge work as well as lumber for further bridge building that had been prepared over the previous winter. It should also be realized that in 1870, the road's location was largely isolated from the outside world. Construction on what was to be the Canadian settler route to the west had been progressing slowly when shut down for the winter at the end of October 1869. In January, all of this changed. Dawson, at his desk in Ottawa, found himself on the receiving end of government communications wanting to know when the road would be ready. He hadn't been there since the previous October. He made the mistake of overpromising. Wolseley would later claim he'd been told the road would be ready when he and his men arrived. This was stretching the truth, and he and Lindsay knew this was not going to be the case. Just how unready it was, however, likely came as something of a shock to him when he got there. With progress stalling and the clock always ticking, Wolseley decided to move the expedition's boats up the Cam River. Some had already gone up the road, but it had been a difficult journey, and Wolseley worried that their weight would further deteriorate the road's surface. He wanted to preserve this for the movement of the expedition's other supplies. Dawson disagreed. The boats were his creation, and he viewed them as being at risk of serious damage during the treacherous haul up the river. He grudgingly dispatched some of his men to carry out the task after a party of troops had successfully moved the first batch up, but he was never in favor of it. It was risky, but Wolseley was probably right regarding the boats. He had to do something to get things moving, but it clearly rankled with Dawson. A three-part article penned by Wolseley later in 1870 and 1871 after his return turned a matter which by then should have been a closed book into an open sore. Wolseley was quite complimentary in his article regarding Dawson, but highly critical of almost everything else Dawson had been responsible for. The public works man had not yet written his final report, and he responded aggressively, and not just regarding the bigger items, but nitpicky things as well. Insofar as the road being a delaying factor, however, there's no question that it was. It's doubtful, though, that this could have been avoided given its state of unreadiness when work shut down in 1869, combined with the forest fires and torrential rains. So let's get started with the journey across country. The advanced elements of the expedition finally set off on the evening of July 16th. The expedition traveled in self-contained boat brigades of typically 6 boats each. The expedition did not move as a compact mass and would be spread out over as much as 150 miles. Wolseley used one of the canoes so that he could move between forward brigades and more easily catch up with the vanguard as and when he needed. There was one guide for each brigade, and each boat had 2 boatmen. Wolseley was critical of many of these and ordered that if either boatman or guide did not know his business, he was to be sent back. Some were weeded out even before departure, or according to Dawson, had quit due to the difficulties of hauling the boats up the Cam River. Even so, 7 who embarked on Shebondown Lake was discharged when the expedition reached Fort Francis. Wolseley had nothing but praise, however, for the Iroquois boatmen recruited from the villages near Montreal. and on some of the most treacherous portages and rapids, he placed their leader in charge with orders that no boat was to pass unless he and his men were present. 3 boat brigades, together with 2 of the expedition's guns, set out on the 16th. The 2 other guns were left behind at the fort at Prince Arthur's Landing. The other brigades would depart at intervals over the next 2+ weeks. The King's Royal Rifle Corps, the Royal Artillery, and the Royal Engineers led the way. The 1st Boat Brigade of the Ontario Rifles departed on July 21st. The 1st of the Quebec Rifles on August 1st. Wolseley made sure he had sufficient strength in the vanguard in case he ran into trouble, hence the reason for 3 brigades and his artillery leaving simultaneously on the 16th. If anyone wanted to lay an ambush, the country was perfect for it, and as has been mentioned, the expedition was strung out over a lengthy distance. A political officer had gone on ahead to speak with the indigenous peoples in the expedition's path. Wolseley met him while en route as the political officer was returning and was informed there would be no opposition. Wolseley still had concerns, however, regarding Fenian and Métis intervention. From our vantage point, we know there was no risk to the expedition from the Fenians. I'll discuss the prospect of Métis opposition when the expedition nears the end of its journey. Wolseley was adamant that no spirits would be consumed, and the men slaked their thirst with tea. The health of the expedition's men remained remarkably robust. Rations had been strictly calculated in advance, but quickly became monotonous. One officer described the food as, quote, choke dog. Each boat had its own cook, and it really depended on the skill of this individual. At least one, by the name of John Carr, in the Ontario Battalion, seems to have been quite adept. Of course, this information comes from Carr's own account. The weight of cargo in each boat ranged from 3,000 to 4,000 pounds. The boats were so heavily laden that the rowers struggled to find places for their feet. There were 47 portages along the route, varying in length from 100 yards to over a mile. Where the boats could be gotten through without having to be dragged across, they were unloaded and run through the rapids. When portaging, everything had to be carried across the difficult terrain. Salted pork half barrels weighed 200 pounds. Flour barrels, 120 pounds. Biscuit barrels, 100 pounds. When not running the boats through, they had to be hauled over as well. They were not lightly constructed craft. Portaging was time-consuming, back-breaking, and dangerous work. One officer recorded that he became proficient at carrying 200 to 250 pound loads, and some of the First Nations guides carried 300 to 400 pound loads. Late in the expedition, one of the boatmen was noted to have carried a weight of 528 pounds, as you see in the slide here. When portaging, everyone who left a record mentions insects. Mosquito oil was largely useless, not to mention probably injurious to the user as it contained creosote. In his darkened tent one night, one officer doused himself in what he thought was mosquito oil, only to find in the morning the bottle next to him contained sauce. Mesh head covers were found to be too cumbersome. They would be used later to strain water when the expedition reached Lake of the Woods. It was eventually noted that the indigenous boatmen rubbed the exposed parts of their bodies with pork fat. The troops would copy this. During the 94 days between the landing of the first British troops at Thunder Bay and the arrival of the British battalion at Upper Fort Garry, it rained, sometimes torrentially, on 45 of them. The men were constantly wet, either from rain or their not infrequent need to get into the water for some task or other. Their clothing quickly began to wear out and rot. The lead brigades reached Fort Francis, about 225 miles from Shebendowin Lake, on August 4th. The troops continued on immediately, but Wolseley remained for a few days. Fort Francis was to become an advanced base, and he wanted to ensure this was set up to his satisfaction. It would contain a hospital with a 36-bed capacity, a field oven, and a bakery. One company of the Ontario Rifles would remain as a garrison. Shortly before arriving at Fort Francis, Wolseley was met by William Butler, his special intelligence officer, who traveled through the United States to gauge American reaction to the expedition. Here's a photograph of Butler in the slide. Butler had passed through the Red River settlement as he sought to link up with the expedition, and even had a meeting with Louis Riel at the upper fort. It's not clear what intelligence Butler actually provided. There's nothing in the official journal that speaks to this, and in a later account, Wolseley seems to confuse information brought by another man as having come from Butler. Nevertheless, the account of his story is an interesting one. While Wolseley completed his tasks at Fort Francis, the brigades ahead of him were able to unfurl their sails on Lake of the Woods and fly across to Rat Portage, today Kenora, Ontario. By the time Wolseley arrived on Lake of the Woods, a storm had blown up, and he was forced to take shelter on an island. As the lake began to calm, against the lake began to calm, against the advice of his Iroquois boatman who believed it was still too rough, he set off without a guide in the gig. He got lost, and the alarm bells were ringing when he finally made his way into Rat Portage, guided by an Indigenous family he had come across along the way. The next stage of the journey down the Winnipeg River to Fort Alexander was the most challenging of the entire trip. Over 163 miles, the river dropped 349 feet. One expedition member reported that it was fortunate that Winnipeg was undertaken near the end of the journey after the men had become proficient in the handling of boats. The accounts also speak to how often near disaster was averted by the skill of the Iroquois and now also Ojibwe boatmen. The British troops had all reached Fort Alexander near Lake Winnipeg by August 18th. Wolseley arrived 2 days later. He had been playing catch-up, and traveling by canoe, his party passed through the two lead Ontario boat brigades struggling down the Winnipeg. It's interesting to contemplate what was going through Wolseley's mind with his goal almost in sight. He would later write of the urgency of reaching the settlement due to letters received from English-speaking residents urging him to make haste. Wolseley did not have all the pieces of the intelligence puzzle at his disposal, as I had when researching the story. As a highly competent professional leading his first independent command and anxious to make an impression, he was going to be ready for all eventualities right up to the end of his mission. This was only natural for a soldier of his stature. However, if we take Wolseley's later writings at face value, in spite of his clear orders that he was not leading a punitive expedition, the closer he got to Fort Garry, the more one is left with the feeling that he was spoiling for a fight. Before leaving Canada, it should be noted that he had fallen in with George Mason of the Canada First movement, one of those most strongly demanding that Ottawa send a force to avenge the killing of Scott. There is, however, absolutely no evidence that Riel ever intended to oppose the arrival of Wolseley's force. In any case, back at Fort Alexander, Wolseley did not wait for the Canadians to catch up, and he set off for Upper Fort Garry on the afternoon of August 21st. Moving when he did would prove to be a wise decision, as a fierce storm was about to blow in that would delay the two Canadian boats immediately behind the British force. The Canadians were unable to cross Lake Winnipeg until the storm abated, and it would have delayed the British troops as well had they lingered at Fort Alexander. There was a fair wind blowing as the flotilla of boats containing the British troops entered Lake Winnipeg. They spent the night on Elk Island and were consumed by the resident insect life. The following morning, they entered the Red River, and for the first time since crossing Height of Land Portage, were moving against the current. Wolseley hoped to make it to Lower Fort Garry before nightfall, but was still 12 miles short when he ordered a halt. Next morning, August 23rd, they set off and breakfasted at the Lower Fort. There, Wolseley learned that nobody in the settlement knew of the force's presence on the river. He wanted to keep it that way. The boats were lightened to 4 days of provisions. The upper fort was 21.5 miles away by road. Most of the troops remained in their boats, with one company moving by road as a flank guard. All of those who left accounts speak of the triumphal reception received. They were, after all, passing through the settlement's English-speaking parishes. By nightfall, they were still 6 miles short of their goal, and the weather had turned decidedly nasty. The rain fell in torrents. The troops spent the night in the open, in the driving rain. Anybody who ventured out from the direction of the upper fort was obliged to spend an unpleasant night in the open as well. Wolseley was determined that the secrecy of his presence would be maintained. By the following morning, the heavy rain had converted the road into a muddy morass, and so it was decided to remain in the boats a while longer. 2 miles from the upper fort, the expedition landed at Point Douglas, and an extended battle order made its final approach. Most accounts speak of the expectation of battle. There was, however, no opposition, and Fort Garry was occupied by the British contingent of the Expeditionary Force on the morning of August 24th. Rial's breakfast was found on the table, but the Métis leader and his immediate followers, possibly having received word of the expedition's mood, wisely decided to withdraw. They were thought to have been seen in the distance, but Wolseley made no effort to pursue, and in subsequent days refused requests from elements of at the settlement who had opposed him to issue warrants for his arrest. It will be recalled earlier that I mentioned Wolseley having wanted to be appointed lieutenant governor as well as the expedition's military commander. Given this had not taken place, he took the view that he lacked the civil authority to sanction the pursuit or apprehension of the Métis leader. He was a military commander only, and his mission had been successfully completed. Almost as soon as the first of the Canadian troops arrived on August 27th, the British contingent began its trek back to Eastern Canada. The first British troops left on August 29th. By October, all were barracked in Quebec, awaiting their departure from Canada. Wolseley left the Red River settlement on September 10th. He'd been there for 18 days. He passed through Toronto without stopping. Lindsay was returning to England and sent word to him suggesting they travel on the same ship. Wolseley left Canada at the beginning of October and would not return to the country where he had served for the better part of a decade. The Canadian contingent remained and became the garrison of Canada's new empire in the West. The period that followed would see the opening of the West to European immigration and the end of the way of life of a great many of the region's inhabitants. In his orders to Wolseley, Lindsay was quite specific as to the need to avoid the inclusion in the expedition of men who'd taken part in the troubles of the previous winter. However, a great many of the Canadian troops who volunteered to go, especially in the Ontario Battalion, were motivated at least to some extent out of a desire to avenge the killing of Scott. And while many of these men would make a contribution to the development of the Canadian West, in the aftermath of their arrival, there's no question that there were acts of retribution against the Métis as well. However, viewed as an example of a British Army military expedition of the Victorian period, the journey of the Red River Expeditionary Force, despite a few hiccups, was a planning and logistical triumph. To take a force of over 1,200 men into the wilderness across a largely disused and forgotten route that had never previously seen such a large body of men was a significant accomplishment and set Wolseley well on his way to the top of his profession. Colonel Wolseley was destined for further high-profile appointments. A quarter of a century later, he would rise to become the commander-in-chief of the British Army. Thank you.
Paul, just a quick question, just on, thank you very much for that. That was excellent.
Thank you.
Question just around the amount of provisioning that was done en route. Was it all literally brought with them, or were there relationships and agreements with respect to provisioning on during the journey?
There were no, essentially everything was taken. I mean, there were attempts to catch fish along the route. There were certainly, there's one of the accounts speaks to the men being on an island and finding a patch of blueberries and just gorging themselves on that. Surprisingly, they didn't take any shotguns because they make mention of a fair amount of bird life, and they could have potentially supplemented the cooking pot with some bird that they managed to bag along the way. First Nations groups did come out to along the path to try and see if they could barter with them, but they're essentially, to get to the root of your question, they were carrying pretty well everything that they needed, and it was a fine line, so they had little with which to barter. So essentially, yes, they were carrying their provisions. They did pick up little bits and pieces along the way. They had their first significant meal that a number of men talk of once they reached Fort Alexander.
Oh, thank you.
Pleasure.
I was interested in hearing this. It's an area of Canadian history that I've looked at quite a bit, and you have obviously looked at it a whole lot more than I. But I was interested to know that one of the Ontario contingent that went out west was a young lad named Sam Steele.
Yeah.
And apparently it was his first visit west, and it was the thing that got him really interested in making the West his lifetime. And Sam Steele's one of my personal heroes.
He's an interesting fellow, and certainly I read his account of his journey on the Red River expedition, and he has a storied history, of course, because he then spends time in the Northwest Mounted Police. He's part of the Yukon Force. He leads the Strathcona's Horse in the Boer War, and then even as late as the First World War in England, he's commanding the 2nd Canadian Division before it goes overseas. So he has a very lengthy and interesting career. There is a new biography. I mean, there's a few biographies of him out there. There's a new biography by Rod McLeod, which I haven't read yet, but I plan to.
It's a dandy, may I suggest.
Okay, great. Good to hear.
The other thing I was going to mention, Garnet Wolseley, of course, he was a big part of the British military activities for the next several decades. He became known as Sir Garnet, and the soldiers' line was, if everything was Sir Garnet.
All Sir Garnet.
It was all Sir Garnet. Everything was neat, tidy.
That's right.
Unlike what he was having to deal with on that horrid trip west.
But his planning for that trip, the trip west, was the reason why it was carried out so spectacularly well.
Indeed.
And he would. And an interesting factor is, although he failed on this occasion, in 1885, he would lead the Gordon Relief Expedition in the Sudan. Yes. And he saw the hiring of Canadian boatmen again. Yes. To take his force up the Nile.
Yes, there's a grand church. Don't ever lose your brain when you're old.
Too late.
Champlain, the Champlain Society has a volume on all that, the travel of the voyageurs to the Sudan. It was quite a story.
It's an interesting tale, indeed. Steele will crop up in because I've been commissioned by Helian and Company to write a book on Canada in the Boer War. So
Another
Steele will
area
be
of my particular interest.
Steele will be cropping up again in my researches.
Yes. My thing is Arthur Conan Doyle and his part of the Boer War, but let's not get into that tonight.
No, that's probably a much bigger topic.
And thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Any other questions?
Paul, were there many people killed during this expedition?
Well, that's an interesting question. If anybody knows anything at all about the Red River expedition, and most people don't, it's typically that they got there without any casualties, which was nothing short of miraculous. Certainly, when Butler was in the States, he read newspaper articles in the States with reports of large numbers of troops drowned in the rapids as they were trying to make their way west. That, of course, didn't happen. But what I did find in one of the diaries of one of the Canadian officers of the expedition, I found a report of what is likely a fatal casualty in the Ontario battalion. They were unloading one of the boats during a portage, and they tossed a bag, and there was a loaded pistol in it. And the bag was dropped, and the pistol discharged and struck one of the men in the chest. He was reported as bleeding profusely at the time, and he was left behind with care, but he was in the middle of nowhere. And my guess is that a chest wound in the middle of nowhere was likely not going to have a positive outcome. I read his name was Private Butcher, and I did not hear anything else about him in the various records of the force. So I suspect he died on the way to Fort Garry. But that was the only man lost.
Any more questions, ladies and gentlemen?
Paul, it's Tony Partington here. Your discussion did not touch on any contribution by the Hudson's Bay Company. Now, at that time, the North American headquarters was in Montreal. This expedition would have gone through there, or certainly the people there, and most of the retained came out of Conowagna. What role did HBC have in this expedition? And
well, actually, sorry, what was that?
And it goes to an ex-8 Hudson's Bay Company settlement. So I'm just surprised not to have any mention.
Well, you keeping in mind that there's 45 minutes to talk about a very large topic.
Yes.
So the Hudson's Bay Company, they're in the process. Just to give maybe a little bit more of the background, they're in the process of selling up, in a sense. They're selling to Canada, and Britain is financing the loan for Canada to make the purchase. The Hudson's Bay Company in the West were largely Hudson's Bay Company were happy to make the sale because it was a pretty good deal for them. Not only did they get a cash settlement, but they also got to hang on to a fair amount of land in the Northwest. So it was a fairly good deal for them in that regard. They did not, however, similarly in a way to Canada, the Canadian government's lack of information to the people living at the Red River settlement, the HBC workers in the West were largely left out of all of this, and certainly their governor in the West, McTavish, he was a dying man at that point, but he wasn't really spoken to by anybody. He'd been out east somewhere, and he'd stopped in Ottawa, but apparently his views weren't really taken into consideration by the Canadian government. So really in the in the West, the workers were rather disillusioned because they didn't know what was happening to them either. They were losing their livelihoods, and they weren't receiving any of the money either, by the way, that the shareholders of the Hudson's Bay Company were going to receive based on the sale. So there was a fair amount of disillusionment amongst the HBC workers in the West. The HBC owners, they would see some of the benefits of the sale. As far as the expedition itself, the expedition did not draw on a huge amount of expertise from the HBC itself. They certainly did with the movement of the boats up the Cam River. As I mentioned in the presentation, Dawson was opposed to it, but Wolseley found an HBC man at Fort William who said that taking the boats up the river was feasible. Dawson said that it just wasn't feasible. So they would draw on expertise locally, but I didn't find any during my research any great information that spoke about dialogue between the HBC and the military planners beforehand.
Thank you for that.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, it's Craig Hanover here. I'm wondering if there are any military medals issued as a result of this campaign.
There was. The Canadian government issued a military medal quite a number of years later. And it was, I'm not a medal guy, but I think it was something like a Canada Service Medal, and there were 3 clasps. One of the clasps for the medal was for the Red River expedition. It, as one source stated, it has the distinction, therefore, of being the only campaign medal ever available to British troops for a campaign that sustained no casualties. However, having said that, I found that there is likely one casualty. So yes, there was a medal, but I believe it was issued by the Canadians. But if there's any medal experts out there, I am willing to stand corrected.
Yeah, Tony Hopkins here.
Tony?
Yes, you mentioned 2 previous military expeditions out to the West, one in 1846 and one in 1857.
Yes.
Could you tell us a bit about those, and particularly how did they get to Winnipeg?
Okay, certainly. Yeah, in 1846, it was in response to the Oregon boundary crisis. So, but in fact, it's an interesting story in that the governor of the HBC in North America, Simpson, at the time, he was, although he played the card that they were needed for protection should the United States forces move north, he spoke privately of really he wanted them as a garrison, a police force to maintain law and order at the settlement. So that was the force there. They came directly from Ireland. I think they weren't stationed in Canada, and they came up onto Hudson's Bay and then up the Hayes River and then across Lake Winnipeg onto the Red River and then into the settlement. The 1857 force was in response to, again, defense due to the United States. Cavalry had been noted by HBC authorities. US cavalry had been seen on the plains south of the settlement. And so it was to establish a British presence. And on that occasion, they were sent, it was part of the Royal Canadian Rifles, which was, as I mentioned in the presentation, was a British regiment stationed permanently in Canada. And they were sent via Hudson's Bay. So they would have sailed presumably from Montreal up around into Hudson's Bay and then again came up the Hayes River. Interestingly, wouldn't classify them as a military expedition, but also in the 1840s, a pair of British officers were sent west during the Oregon crisis, Lieutenants War and Vavasor, to learn more about the goings on in the West should war break out over the Oregon border. They did go the route, essentially by the same route that the Red River expedition would go, and their report said that it was suitable for a military force, though their heavier ordnance should go up the Hayes River. So given that information, I don't know why the 1857 expedition traveled all the way onto Hudson's Bay from Canada, but they did. Hopefully that answers your question. But
it does, but it leads to another. You call the Royal Canadian Regiment a British regiment?
yeah, the Royal Canadian Regiment was a regiment of the British Army.
Was it raised
pardon
in
me,
England or raised in Canada?
It was a pardon me, it was the Royal Canadian Rifles. It was
Okay, in any case.
it was a regiment of long service soldiers that were paid extra money. These guys were veterans, and they were going to remain in Canada. And one of the reasons behind the creation of this regiment, which took place in the early 1840s, was it was more about stopping British Army deserters making a run for the States. You must understand that, you know, the British Army of that day and age was a fairly rough and ready organization, largely recruited from among the poorer classes of society. As the United States began to develop, there was an attraction for jobs with higher wages for soldiers serving in Canada, and desertion to the United States became an issue. So the Royal Canadian Rifles was partially, not solely, but was partially created to watch the border crossing points and try and prevent this sort of thing from happening. The other reason they were created was because the British Army just had such a problem moving with the British Army was a fairly small army by comparison with continental armies. They always had units in movement or serving out in various colonies. So it was a way to try and provide some level of permanence to at least one unit stationed in Canada.
Splendid, thank you.
You're welcome.
Were they disbanded in Canada?
They were disbanded in
Canada.
They were disbanded when the British withdrew their garrison. They were offered to the Canadian government as the formation of a Canadian permanent military force. This was turned down, and so they were disbanded. As I mentioned in the presentation, they were offered, it was suggested that they be designated as the Canadian contingent for the expedition. The Canadian Militia Department turned it down, but with the delays in the raising of the Montreal Rifles, Lindsay lost patience and ended up just recruiting about 120 of them, and they moved out to the west, and I suspect that the majority of them settled out there.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
How about Louis Riel and all this? At the end
Pardon
of the
me?
story, Louis Riel,
Yes.
in your story, how did he? I know how he ended up, but at what stage was Manitoba and Louis Riel and the Métis involved in all this?
Well, in the origins of it, as I mentioned in the presentation, there had been very little, if any, preparation for the people living at the Red River to understand what was about to happen. A number of events had occurred in the 2 years or so preceding the Canadian takeover that caused the Métis to be very concerned about what would happen after a Canadian takeover. And so they ultimately determined that they were going to make the case for themselves. And Louis Riel who came back to the settlement around about that time, rose to become their leader and make their case.
Thank you very much. Good.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much, Paul, for
You're welcome.
an interesting and informative presentation. And I might add that Paul has graciously offered to donate his book to RCMI Library. Thank you very much, Paul.
You're welcome.
Yes.
My pleasure.
Now, this time I usually present our speaker with a gift of appreciation from RCMI, but unfortunately you're in BC and I'm in Ontario, so physically not possible, COVID or no COVID. And keep a sharp eye on your post box and we'll let Canada Post do the job for me. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much for asking me to speak.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now and thank you for joining us.